Cecil John Rhodes died in 1902. Robert Gabriel Mugabe was born 22 years later, in 1924. They never met, never exchanged a single word. They never even lived in the same century. Yet the story of Zimbabwe is, in many ways, the story of these two extraordinary men. Their lives bookend the colonial era in southern Africa and its long, turbulent aftermath. Rhodes came to southern Africa as an empire builder, driven by an unshakable belief that British rule was history's inevitable destiny. Through conquest, vast wealth, and political ambition, he forged the colonial state that would bear his name. In the process, he transformed the lives of millions and became the principal architect of a system of white settler dominance whose legacy would endure long after his death. Mugabe was a product of the colonial order Rhodes had created, but he devoted his life to destroying it. Forged by the injustices of white minority rule, he rose to become the face of Zimbabwe's liberation struggle, determined to end colonial domination and reclaim the land, sovereignty, and political future that Rhodes had envisioned as permanent possessions of the British Empire. Separated by a generation and united only by history, Rhodes and Mugabe became adversaries across time. One built the world, the other vowed to dismantle. Their ideas, ambitions, and legacies collided long after Rhodes was buried, and the consequences of that collision continue to echo across Zimbabwe today. To understand the nation's triumphs, its tragedies, and its enduring divisions, one must first understand the two men who, though they never met, became the architects of its destiny. Today, we ask the impossible question. What if these two titans had collided in the 1890s, at the height of Rhodes's ambition and the fury of the First Chimurenga? All documented history of Rhodes, the British South Africa Company, Lobengula, and the Chimurenga is true. Mugabe's role is speculation. But this thought experiment reveals the forces that still shape a nation. Long before the British flag crossed the Limpopo, this land thrummed with power. Great Zimbabwe, its mortarless walls still standing after 6 centuries, was a medieval African metropolis of gold, ivory, and cattle trade reaching Arabia, India, and China. Yet when European explorers and settlers encountered these remarkable ruins in the 19th century, many refused to believe that Africans could have built them. Driven by the racial assumptions of the age and a desire to justify colonial rule, they attributed the city to outsiders, Phoenicians, Arabs, biblical figures such as the Queen of Sheba or other long-lost civilizations. Accepting that the ancestors of the Shona had created such an advanced society would have undermined the colonial myth that Africa's civilization had always depended on foreign hands. The evidence tells a very different story. Archaeology, linguistics, and oral tradition all point to the same conclusion, that Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona. It was not the work of wandering empires or mysterious foreigners. It was the achievement of Africans, whose civilization flourished centuries before European conquest. When Great Zimbabwe's power waned in the 15th century, its authority did not vanish, it migrated. The Mutapa state rose in the north, and later the Rosvi, under rulers who took the title Changa Mire, built a confederacy that stretched across the plateau, guarding the same gold routes that had made the old capital rich. By the time European prospectors arrived 4 centuries later, they were not stepping into a void. They were stepping onto ground with its own deep memory of statecraft. By the 19th century, new powers rose. The Rosvi successor states, the Shona chiefdoms, and the formidable Ndebele kingdom under King Lobengula, a military state forged from Zulu traditions, rich in diplomacy and iron. This was no empty wilderness. It was a world of kings, traders, and warriors. The Ndebele themselves were forged in fire. In the early 1820s, a Kumalo chief named Mzilikazi broke from Shaka's Zulu kingdom rather than surrender cattle taken in a raid. Fleeing north through the chaos of the Mufakani, he rebuilt his shattered following into a new nation, organizing every man into age-based regiments, the Amabutso, small, disciplined companies of perhaps a few hundred warriors each, bound to regimental towns rather than to old clan loyalties. By 1840, this system had carried his people across the Limpopo into the land they called Mthwakazi. His son Lobengula inherited a kingdom that ran on the same military logic, a state that was, at its core, an army with a society built around it. Cecil Rhodes arrived in Africa in 1870, a sickly 17-year-old sent for his health. He found diamonds at Kimberley. While others chased single stones, Rhodes built an empire. By his 30s, De Beers controlled 90% of the world's diamonds. Wealth was never the end, it was the weapon. In 1877, still in his 20s, he drafted a will calling for a secret society to extend British rule across the globe, even dreaming of reclaiming America. He believed the English-speaking peoples were the first race, destined to civilize the world. His Cape to Cairo vision demanded a red line of empire from south to north. The scramble for Africa gave him his chance. Rhodes had been courting Lobengula for years before the decisive blow. Small gold prospecting concessions signed and quietly renewed since 1880 had already built a fragile channel of trust. In 1888, his agents Charles Rudd, Rochfort Mbuya, and Francis Thompson pushed further. Lobengula kept them waiting a full month at Bulawayo, wary and under pressure from Indunas who wanted no dealings with whites at all. The Rudd party won ground only through bribery, paying off the missionary Charles Helm, whom Lobengula trusted, and two senior Indunas, Lotchi and Sikombo, to speak in their favor. The king was told and believed that no more than 10 white men would ever enter his territory to dig, and that the document changed nothing about his sovereignty. The written concession said something else entirely: exclusive control of all minerals in his kingdom, and the power to enforce that control by arms in exchange for rifles, ammunition, a gunboat on the Zambezi, and a modest monthly stipend. Lobengula spent his final years trying to disavow a document he never fully understood, even signing a rival concession to a German financier, Edward Lippert, purely to sabotage Rhodes, only to watch Rhodes quietly buy out Lippert's claim too. When the king discovered how deep Lotchi's betrayal ran, he had the Induna and his family put to death. With the Rudd Concession in hand, Rhodes travelled to London and secured a royal charter for the British South Africa Company. A private company granted the power to rule, tax, make war, and seize land. In 1890, the pioneer column raised the Union Jack at Fort Salisbury. Rhodes's dream was advancing. But the Ndebele kingdom stood in the way. In 1893, the First Matabele War erupted. Ndebele courage met industrial horror. Behind wagon lagers, the Maxim gun, the first true machine gun, tore through regiments whose entire military culture had been built for a different kind of war, one of massed courage and close-quarters discipline rather than sustained automatic fire. "Whatever happens," Hilaire Belloc later wrote, "we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not." Lobengula burned Bulawayo and fled, dying, likely of smallpox, somewhere north of the Zambezi in early 1894. His kingdom fell. Then came dispossession. Land carved into settler farms, cattle seized, hut taxes imposed. Rinderpest, drought, and locusts ravaged the people. Ancestral spirits seemed to have turned away. In 1896, Matabeleland and Mashonaland exploded in the First Chimurenga. Spirit mediums like Mbuya Nehanda, born Charwe Nyakasikana, believed to channel the ancestral spirit of a Mutapa-era princess, and Sekuru Kaguvi called the people to arms, giving scattered local grievances a shared religious and political language. Chiefs coordinated local resistance. For months, company rule tottered. Rhodes himself walked unarmed into the Matobo Hills for the Indaba negotiations, betting his life that his own nerve could do what the Maxim guns had not: end the uprising without a costlier, drawn-out war. By 1897, the uprising was crushed. Nehanda and Kaguvi were captured, tried and hanged in 1898. Nehanda is remembered as going to the gallows prophesying, "My bones shall rise again." Now enter the speculation. Imagine a mission-educated teacher, disciplined, bookish, patient, and strategically brilliant, alive in 1896 instead of 1924. Robert Mugabe, stripped of Marxist rhetoric and modern weapons, but armed with his core traits: meticulous organization, respect for existing authority, and a deep understanding that legitimacy flows from the land and ancestral memory. He would not charge with an assegai. He would organize, use mission networks for communication, coordinate warnings between Shona and Ndebele, two peoples whose relationship had itself been forged through decades of raiding and, later, shared grievance under company rule. Bridge spirit mediums and practical strategy, link local victories into something resembling a wider campaign, cut telegraph lines in unison, ambush supply columns with intelligence. Rhodes and this Mugabe would share surprising parallels, both visionary, both education-obsessed, both convinced history had chosen them, one for empire, one for reclamation. Better coordination would have made the Chimurenga far costlier, longer, bloodier. It might have strained company finances, alarmed London investors, and forced earlier compromises on land and tax. Rhodes had already been weakened by the Jameson raid, his disastrous, unauthorized 1895 attempt to trigger an uprising against the Boer government in the Transvaal, a scandal that cost him the premiership of the Cape Colony and dented the company's standing in London just as the Chimurenga broke out. He was not invincible. Yet outright victory? Almost impossible. The technological chasm, Maxims, rifles, railways, reinforcements, was too vast. As with the Zulu at Isandlwana or Ethiopia at Adwa, courage alone could not overcome industrial empire. But making conquest too expensive, that was achievable. In reality, Mugabe inherited the memory. The Second Chimurenga framed itself as the continuation of Nehanda's war. Guerrilla fighters of the 1970s invoked her prophecy directly. In 1980, Zimbabwe was born, named not for Rhodes, but for the ancient African city. The Zimbabwe bird soared on the new flag. Mugabe's early rhetoric was reconciliatory. He spoke of turning swords into plowshares and invited white farmers and civil servants to stay and contribute to the new nation. For several years the economy grew, education and health services expanded dramatically for the black majority, and Zimbabwe was hailed as a success story. Yet land remained contested. Gukurahundi, the mid-1980s campaign against dissidents and civilians in Matabeleland and the Midlands, the same region Lobengula once ruled, brought tragedy that still shadows relations between Zimbabwe's Shona and Ndebele communities. In 2000, Mugabe launched the fast-track land reform program, hailed by supporters as the Third Chimurenga. Vast tracts of white-owned commercial farmland were acquired, often through violent and chaotic occupations. For many black Zimbabweans, it fulfilled a long-delayed promise of land restitution and marked the end of a deeply unequal colonial land system. But the rapid and often disorderly implementation severely disrupted commercial agriculture. Production of maize, tobacco, and other key exports fell sharply, while the wider economy spiraled into collapse. Hyperinflation, food shortages, soaring unemployment, and a mass exodus of Zimbabweans followed, leaving the country profoundly transformed. Both men's legacies are complicated. Rhodes, miner, builder, architect of dispossession. Mugabe, liberator, educator, architect of both triumph and suffering. Rhodes lies buried at Malindidzimu, sacred ground, chosen, some accounts say, because he too was struck by its stillness. He thought his empire eternal. It lasted barely 8 decades after his death. Mugabe believed he completed a struggle begun long before him. His legacy remains fiercely debated. The imagined duel never happened, yet the contest between conquest and reclamation echoed across a century, on battlefields, in classrooms, on farms, and in the soul of a nation. Rhodes and Mugabe represent opposing poles of the same historical arc. Rhodes personified the hubris of European imperialism, the belief that a small cadre of civilized outsiders could legitimately rule, rename, and reorder an entire region for their benefit. Mugabe embodied the fury of the dispossessed, the intoxicating triumph of liberation, and the tragic ease with which revolutionary movements can reproduce the authoritarian structures they once opposed. Zimbabwe's story is richer and older than either man, rooted in Great Zimbabwe's medieval stone ruins, the Mutapa and Rosvi empires, the Ndebele state, and resilient Shona and Ndebele cultures. But the collision between Rhodes's colonial project and Mugabe's nationalist counter-project defined the country's 20th and early 21st century fate, from chartered company rule through settler statehood and bitter war, to independence, hope, authoritarian consolidation, economic ruin, and repeated attempts at renewal. The land, the mines, the contested memory of who belongs and who built what, these issues still echo. Rhodes's grave in the Metopos still draws controversy and occasional calls for removal. Mugabe's legacy remains bitterly divided, hero of independence to some, architect of national decline to many others. Their ghosts, though separated by a generation and an ideology, continue to shape the politics, economy, and identity of modern Zimbabwe. If this documentary resonated with you and you'd like to explore more stories like it, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue creating thoughtful, in-depth work. We hope to see you in the next one.